how a geneticist reads the Bible. Well, I mean, the Bible like everybody else, but of course, when I read texts, because of some of what I know from genetics, sometimes the text will like kind of tap me on the brain a little bit and say, "Wow, what's going on there? What what might I be able to apply from what I know from genetics, and what might it help me in understand the text better?" And so today I'm going to take four or five texts that for me have been enlightened specifically because of genetics, and I'll try and explain to you some of the underlying genetics so you can also maybe get the same insights and kind of enjoy that. So a little bit of this is just about fascination, but the other part is that as I share some of these too, some of them are going to touch on the way that people behave and how they and who they are and what their identities are and that sort of thing, and how genetics is underlying some of that process of identity and process of behavior and how we behave. And I want at the end I want to really encourage a conversation among all of us as to, well, how do we knowing this, knowing that genetics plays such an important part in who we are, how do we make allowance for that, and how do we actually still love people and accept them and not ostracize them, which sometimes the church seems to do when people aren't behaving in ways that we expect them to. So keep that in the back of your mind. But as we go along, just kind of, I hope, marvel a little bit in what our modern understandings of things like genetics have done to help us in a few places in the Bible. And so here's four texts, and I just want to read them first. These are ones that, for me, I say they tweak geneticists. So as a geneticist, I read it and I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. First one's a very early text, Genesis 4:17, and one that I'm sure many of you have also wondered about. Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. And the question there, of course, is who was this wife? Where did Cain find a wife? And I'm going to apply a little genetics to that and kind of ponder it a bit. And then a little later, we have Jacob. And I think the most famous of all the texts that has a genetic explanation is Jacob with Laban. And this is the center part of that story. It says, then Jacob placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Sounds kind of magical. Okay. And then Genesis 4:41-57. So notice a lot of these are really early in the Bible, because I think a lot of the underlying kind of origin stories about Israel and other things do have some aspects to them that really modern research has helped with. And this one's about Egypt and Joseph. All the countries came into Egypt to Joseph to buy corn because that famine was so sore in all lands. Well, we'll get to that later as to why that's tweaks a geneticist. So I'll leave that one for now. Then Deuteronomy 5:9. This one has been troubling to me on many levels, and I think many of us dealing with the Old Testament, we often wonder, why is God so vindictive, and why is he so, nasty in his punishment? You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Of course, this is from the Ten Commandments. This is the second version of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy. Punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. That just sounds mean. And for a long time, very troubling text. But I have some genetics to apply to that too, that I think may help us understand why that text is there and what the author might have meant when he wrote that. Then lastly, Matthew 19:12, very well-known text from the New Testament for those in the LGBT community. And I want to kind of focus on that, kind of the last one we'll look at. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. So that's for many in the LGBT community feel that addresses them. So starting with the first one, who was Cain's wife? And I know many of you have thought about this, and you've probably heard the various theories. And there's the text again. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So there's this other place, not in Eden. It's away from his parents. And it doesn't say where he found the wife, but it says he's over there in Nod, and he says Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. So there's a number of aspects of that that are kind of fascinating. A city, well, if you're building a city, it would seem you have a kind of a population of people to sort of inhabit that city as well. So that brings up a question. Now, traditionally, of course, scholars, the more conservative scholars have always assumed that Cain simply married one of his sisters because, he's one of the first few children of Adam and Eve, and there wouldn't have been much of anybody available for him to marry, so it must have been a sister. And of course, we're never given her name, so we don't really know much more about it. Later scholars have often begun to ponder this further and said, well, maybe there were other people in existence. Maybe it wasn't just Adam and Eve. Maybe Adam and Eve weren't the only people in existence. That, of course, brings up a lot of other issues, but nevertheless, it certainly seems like a reasonable thing. And let me now shift to a bit of genetics perspective. If you marry a sister, okay, this is one of the things that we have to kind of ponder. If Cain did marry a sister, one of the things you have to worry about is a thing called genetic load. There's a reason why many cultures, in fact, pretty much all cultures, have a taboo against marrying, especially brothers and sisters marrying. And anthropologists have long considered it's because of this genetic load that is there. And when a couple that are brother and sister marry, they are very likely to have the same lethal alleles, recessive lethal alleles, as their, siblings. They're very highly likely to be carrying the same ones. Now, what are recessive lethal alleles? Well, for every kind of genetic disease, most genetic diseases are caused by a recessive genetic defect, meaning that if you get one copy of it, and we all get two copies of every of the genes for every trait we have, and if you get just one copy, it isn't expressed. It doesn't cause the disease. So we say it's recessive, it sort of hides. But if you get two copies of that defective gene, you will develop the disease. So you can see here that if a brother and sister marry and they're likely carrying a large number of these same recessive lethal alleles, there's a high probability that they will both pass it on to a child and thus appear to be cursed. And thus why many cultures have a taboo against brother-sister marriages, because they have observed that, they seem to be cursed in many cases when brothers and sisters marry. So knowing that, it would seem like Cain marrying a sister would be a little bit risky, and certainly they would have a lot of children, most likely, at least several of their children would probably have serious problems. Notice there's a term for this, by the way, called consanguinity, and in a lot of cultures, not only brothers, sisters, but even cousins and things like that are off limits. And so most often first or second marriages, sometimes uncle or niece, those kinds of marriages are considered to be also not good. And from a genetics perspective, they're not the best choice. So the more closely related two individuals are, the higher probability that they are carrying the same recessive lethal alleles, because they have the same ancestors where they would have gotten them from. And so the incidence of birth defects and so on is much higher in those groups. And so brother-sister marriages, worst of all, and probably not the best route for Cain. And so that's why a lot of scholars say, well, maybe there were other people and he married someone else. That would seem more reasonable. Now, just to give perspective, though, in the world, there are some cultures where consanguineous marriages are more or less okay. They're usually only second cousin. Some of these cultures allow first cousin marriages. They don't allow much closer than that, but you can see where they cluster. This is a world map showing the incidence of consanguineous marriages today, at least. And you can see that in much of the world, the gray color there, less than 5% of marriages fall into that consanguineous category. But you can see the Middle East and North Africa and little parts there of southwestern kind of Asia there. Those areas do have some cultural practices that allow for some consanguineous marriages. And you can see there in the Middle East, which would have included the land of Israel, about 30 to 39% of marriages are of that sort. And that's primarily because those cultures have a kind of a tribal kind of culture often, where people are encouraged to marry within their tribe, and which makes it much more likely they're going to marry someone that's related to themselves. And that, of course, over time, I should point out that over time, if a culture practices consanguineous marriage, that genetic load actually drops somewhat because some of those lethal alleles start getting weeded out of the population. So it can reduce the genetic load, which means that consanguineous marriages are less problematic over time. So although the argument that Cain probably had to marry someone outside the family to have, a successful marriage and children, although that's a pretty good argument, it isn't ironclad. He could have maybe married a sister, but the context of the story seems to suggest he found someone else. So anyway, that's just one example of something that as a geneticist, I look at that and say, well, maybe he did marry somebody else, and there would have been good reasons for that. Now, Egypt. As I was growing up, I read this story, and this is, of course, a little quote here from the dream that Pharaoh had, Genesis 41. And he slept and dreamed the second time, and behold, 7 ears of corn, and there it is, ears of corn, came upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 ears and blasted with the east wind sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And I'm leaving out a lot of the intervening story here where Joseph, of course, interprets the dream and points out that this is talking about 7 years of famine and well, 7 years of plenty first, followed by 7 years of famine. And then, of course, Joseph suggests to Pharaoh that they stock up food in preparation for the famine because this period of surplus would provide them with enough to put aside. And then, of course, later at the end of the chapter here, on all countries came into Egypt, this is now during the famine, to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands. And so there it is, corn, corn, corn. It's all in there in the text. And as I was growing up as a child, I remember, some of you may remember these, they had the Bible in living sound, and there were records and stuff. And I remember listening to that. And we also had the Bible stories, and corn was mentioned there too. And I was like, wow, it's corn, and so on. Well, of course, I became a biologist and a geneticist. And as I did that, I discovered that it may not actually be the case, but let me just show you how deep this is. Here's a song. I ran across this, Corn in Egypt. So the story of corn, and by the way, if you don't recognize the version here, this is the King James version, and I chose it for a reason, because it is the King James version that says corn. If you read your modern versions, it doesn't say corn. So we'll get to that. But here's this song, Corn in Egypt. And I love the chorus. There is corn in Egypt, and enough to spare. God has made provision in his storehouse there. In a land of famine, oh, why will ye die? There is corn in Egypt. Come to Christ and buy. Now, I don't remember ever singing this song. It's not in the Adventist hymnal, but this is a song in a songbook that actually has the title "Corn in Egypt" on the front of it, which I thought was very interesting to kind of highlight that idea. But was there corn in Egypt? The answer is actually no. There was no corn in Egypt. So that immediately, for me as a geneticist, brought up the question, wow, what in the world? Why is corn mentioned in this text if there was no corn in Egypt? Corn was originally domesticated in the New World. So Central America first, and then later in other parts of the New World. It was spread around. And the Old World did not get corn until after Columbus's voyage to America. Sometime after that, the people began to introduce corn to Europe. So corn was not in Egypt. It simply wasn't there. And I think what people often also don't think about, those of you that are not biologists, that don't, look at plants and say, oh, this is interesting, don't realize that a lot of the crops that we even associate with certain cultures were not in Europe until after Columbus. That includes tomatoes. Can you imagine Italy, Italian cuisine without tomatoes? Hard to imagine. But that's a fairly recent cuisine because it's after the 16th century or the 15th century that would have developed. Potatoes, Ireland without potatoes. Yeah, they didn't have potatoes before Columbus came to America. So that was also introduced to Europe. Sunflowers, squash, and God forbid, chocolate. One of my favorites, and I'm thankful that my ancestors, I'm of European ancestry, they had chocolate, but only because it was brought over after Columbus discovered America. So these are all crops that were domesticated first in the New World and were never known in Europe until much later. So, so what about this corn thing? And here's the history, by the way, just so you know. This is on the left. This is a picture of teosinte on the left, and on the right is what is today called maize in much of the New World. And that's actually some of the maize that's more close to its original types that would have been domesticated fairly early on in the domestication of the New World. But notice what corn was developed from. That thing on the left hardly looks like corn at all. It looks kind of like well, almost a stalk of wheat in a way. It barely looks like it would qualify as corn. But within just a matter of several hundred years to a few thousand years, and we don't know the exact timing for the domestication of corn, but the teosinte was transformed into what we call corn today, or maize. And you can see the name down there. It says Zea maize, subspecies parviglumus. That teosinte is just a subspecies of Zea maize. Zea maize is maize, or the modern corn that we have today. It's just a different subspecies. But that was developed in Central America, and you can see on this diagram here, the map of Central and South America, that it was first domesticated in Central America, and that was its primary domestication center, starting with that teosinte, the parviglumus, and you can see there the semi-domesticated forms and then the ancestral domestic maize there that it is the forerunner to our modern maize. And then it was moved, transported into parts of South America, and some re-domestication, some secondary improvement of those crops was taking place there. And if you go to Central and South America, and I haven't had a chance to do this much, but if you go down there, they have all different kinds of corn. It's a whole bunch of diversity there. But this was just never in Egypt. It wasn't a part of that. So the big question is, I guess, for some of you that maybe grew up thinking that Joseph gathered corn into the storehouses in Egypt might be, well, what was that about? Well, it's simply a translation problem. And a lot of people don't realize this and don't now, because now we use modern translations. But the King James word for corn, or the King James word corn, was a general word for grain. So there was no intention there of saying it was corn. Corn was the word used in King James to refer to grain of any type. And so that may have been any of a variety of crops such as wheat, barley, rye, etc. Didn't specify, and there was no intention to suggest it was corn. And even the phrase "ears of corn" was, the King James English for heads of grain. And so what Pharaoh was seeing in his dream was heads of grain. And that's what it is in the Hebrew. If you translate it properly in modern English, you end up with translating it into grain and heads of grain. So those are the words that we see now. So if you go to the New International Version, that's the way you're going to see it expressed, that they were gathering grain. And I've not done enough research on this to know exactly what grain theologians think was being gathered in Egypt. It could have been any of those on the list, and the Hebrew doesn't really specify either. So it might be difficult to track down what it was, but it wasn't corn. So there you go. It wasn't corn. Now to my favorite story, Jacob and the goats. And my question is this the first case of GMOs? And I know some of you know what a GMO is, right? A GMO is a genetically modified organism. And I know that some people are afraid of GMOs. They think, oh, they're dangerous to eat and all that. Here, as a geneticist, I'm just going to tell you, GMOs are perfectly safe. And also, the term is kind of misleading because any organism that's been genetically modified or bred in special ways is truly a GMO. So I would argue that Jacob was the first geneticist, actually, breeding these goats and these sheep for his own purposes. And so I'm going to read this text just to remind us of the story. Jacob, however, took fresh cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. The flocks were in heat and came to drink. They made it in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves and made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so that they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there. So the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. In this way, the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and maidservants and men servants and camels and donkeys. Now, the way this reads, it sounds like he's doing a little bit of divination or some sort of magical process. And when I was younger, before I had much understanding of genetics, I also thought, well, maybe those streaked branches had some chemicals in them or something that modified what was happening or something. But no, it's none of that actually. And in fact, if you look at another verse, there's another place where this is referred to, and it refers to Jacob kind of getting some advice from God here. And I would say, maybe God was giving God knows genetics, so maybe he was kind of, tweaking Jacob a little bit and saying, hey, think about this. In breeding season, I once had a dream. So this is Jacob having a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. Maybe there's something about those speckled goats and sheep, and God's saying, Jacob, pay attention. Okay, well, let's ponder this a bit. I want to give you some genetics now. So this is a short genetics lesson, so we can talk in more detail about the goats. And I'm going to go to peas. You may know that Mendel discovered genes a long time ago. By the way, I see a hand raised, and I don't mind stopping for a second. This might be a good place to do that. If somebody has a question. So let me, yeah. Did somebody have a question? I saw a hand up. Yeah.
Lawton, did you want to ask a question earlier, or is your hand up by mistake?
That might have been
Yeah,
a
okay.
mistake. I don't.
I think
Okay.
so.
So I'll keep going, but I just wanted to make sure because I don't have a problem stopping briefly if we need to answer something. But anyway, I want to give you a genetics lesson. So this is little genetics from Mendel. You may remember, some of you took a little bit of biology in high school maybe and picked up some Mendel. Mendel studied genetics using peas. And peas aren't goats, but it all works the same. So he started first. One of his early crosses was crossing purple flowered peas with white flowered peas. And what he discovered was when he crossed those two, and notice he's doing a one-way cross here. He's taking pollen from the white flowered ones and putting it on the purple ones, and the offspring are all purple. Okay, that's really notable. Remember, I mentioned about recessive alleles, recessive genes. Well, the white trait here is hidden because all of those plants have one purple contribution from the purple parent and one white contribution from the white parent, and that one purple one makes them purple. Okay, so that was the first thing Mendel discovered, is that there was this sort of effect that some genes were dominant and some were recessive. Now he went on and he took those F1s, as he called them, the first generation hybrids, and put my pointer up here. So these first generation, the F1 hybrids are all purple, and he allowed them to self-fertilize. Nice thing with pea plants, they can do that. And when he then grew the offspring from those self-fertilized plants, he got 3/4 of the offspring were purple and 1/4 were white. Now, Mendel concluded from this, by the way, that there was particle that determined color, and that each plant had two particles. And as long as they had one purple particle, they would be purple. If all they had were two white particles, they'd be white. And so these purple ones are considered the dominant type, or the dominant phenotype, as he called them. And these are the white phenotype. And these white ones are homozygous always for two white alleles. That's it. The purple ones are either homozygous for purple or they're heterozygous. They have one purple and one white, and they come out purple. So that's a key to understanding a little bit about how you can breed things and get certain kinds of outcomes. And Mendel, worked that out a lot to figure out how genetics actually worked. Now I want to go to modern genetics. Mendel had no idea about DNA. Okay, he did not know about chromosomes. He didn't know about any of that stuff. Today we do. And most of you know that your genes are located on chromosomes. And that may be about as far as it goes for many people. Next step is to realize that every one of us has our chromosomes in pairs. So do pea plants. And each pair of chromosomes has the same genes on it, but different versions of those genes. And we call those genes loci, locus for singular here. And the different versions of the gene are called alleles. Okay, so there could be a purple allele and there can be a white allele. So here's our purple allele up here, let's say, and here's our white allele down here. And so you can have either one of each, or you can have two whites, or you can have two purples, like I mentioned there for the flowers, and that determines what color the flower is going to be. And so for Jacob, he doesn't know about chromosomes. He doesn't know about genes either. But you know what? A breeder doesn't need to have this deeper understanding, but we do today. And so when we look back at Jacob's goats, what we now can say, and we know the genetics nowadays, that there's a gene for plain colored goats, okay? And this gene comes in two forms, two alleles. There's a capital S allele, that's the dominant allele, that causes the plain color. Okay, so those goats are not going to be streaked or spotted. They're going to be plain colored. But if a goat has the little s allele, has two copies of the little s allele, they will be spotted or streaked. So the S allele, the big S allele, is dominant to the little one. So if you have at least one big S, you're going to be plain colored. So here's what it looks like for the goats then. Each goat possesses two of these alleles for the coat pattern. If they're SS, capital S, or big S, little s, they're going to be plain colored. If they're little s, they're streaked. So now you think about, okay, so what would Jacob want to do to increase his numbers of streaked goats? Well, he needs to be smart about this. He's going to have to mate goats that are both streaked. And that would be the best, but what if he can't do that? What if he doesn't have enough streaked ones to mate? He needs to start somewhere. So if he can identify which ones are heterozygous, he could mate those, and he would be mating two plain colored goats, and some of their offspring, a quarter of them, are going to be streaked. So once he figures out which ones are these heterozygotes, he can start breeding those as well. So he can certainly breed the streaked with streaked. That makes more streaked. Notice how he separated them into his own flock. So that he did. But once he's identified those heterozygotes, he can also preferentially mate those together and still pull a quarter of Laban's goats away from him. You see? Smart guy. So that's his plan. And of course, I think in a sense, and it's hard to say whether Jacob thought the streak branches and all that kind of stuff made any difference, but he certainly had figured out a plan to steal goats from Laban, so to speak. And he's a tricky guy. So I think that the whole streak branches and stuff in front of the watering troughs was just a ruse to make Laban think he was doing magic or something, but he really was doing genetics. God gave him that hint and he went with it. And it turns out, too, there's another kind of thing that's helpful here. Often heterozygous goats that are heterozygous, have one of each allele, and let's say they have one of each allele, a lot of different other genes, they have what's called hybrid vigor. So by mating those goats, he's also increasing their health of the flock. So the guy has really, really got on here to a really good approach. And he is able to then, whoops, I didn't mean to go ahead there. He's able to increase his flock, and Laban's like scratching his head. How's this working? And he's got his large flock now of these streaked goats. So wonderful, wonderful approach. And I say that's the first, geneticist in the case of Jacob. Okay, now let's go to this, to me, one of the most troubling texts in the Bible. This is Deuteronomy 5:9. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Wow. That sounds like a really mean person. And I, some of us look at that and say, can I worship a God that's going to treat the children, punish children and grandchildren for the sins of the fathers? Well, I think from genetics, we need to kind of ponder a bit. There are two things that we study nowadays in genetics that tell us about what effects genetics is going to have on future generations. One is heritability, just what you inherit from your parents. And heritability is a statistical measurement of how likely genetic traits are to be passed on to offspring. And then there's epigenetics, which we've learned about more recently, which is that genes expression can be modified because of environmental effects. And those environmental effects can result in different expressions that lead to different outcomes in the offspring, even though they may have genes that are, let's say, very positive for very positive things. It changes in the expression of those genes might lead to negative effects. And we now know that many behavioral traits show very high heritability. So, for example, major depression, alcoholism, 50%. So, on average, half of the children from an alcoholic are also going to probably be alcoholic. That's an average, of course. It's not mean that's, it's a tendency. Um, Over 80% for schizophrenia. That's got a really high loading, and bipolar disorder. So a lot of behavioral things. And I didn't put this on the list, but they've even found that political affiliation has a high heritability. So think about that. Republicans have a tendency to make more Republicans, not just because of the way they might be telling their children things, but because there's something inherently genetically influencing people to be that way, to have those kinds of behavioral characteristics. And many behavioral characteristics, almost everything they ever look at is at least close to 50%. Now, add to that epigenetic changes. These are changes to the expression of genes, and those can also be inherited. Once those changes have been instituted in the parents, they sometimes get passed down to their offspring as well. Now, I need to give a little bit more explanation, especially about the epigenetics part, because this is a little complicated, but this is such a fascinating thing. There have been a number of studies now of famine and starvation and what effect that has on future generations. So I'd like you to focus on two of these in detail here. One was the Dutch cohort. This was during World War II. There was a year of famine and hunger. And what they discovered during this year of famine and hunger is that women who were pregnant during that year gave birth to children who later in life, and this study that this diagram comes from did not characterize this first generation, but other studies have. And the first generation of children out of these parents, these mothers who experienced the famine, was that these individuals experienced decreased lifespan due to metabolic disorders. They often developed heart disease more higher than the rest of the population. They developed cardiovascular issues, renal issues, a variety of other things that led to a lower life expectancy. That's not reflected on this chart, but notice that it continued to the next generation, so that the grandchildren of this generation of women who were carrying their babies during the famine, the grandchildren are still experiencing decreased lifespans because of their parents experiencing it in utero. So that, and now we've studied that since that time. They had suspected that this was what was called an epigenetic effect, that somehow there was some sort of change in the expression of the genes. We now know that it is, and I'll show you in the next in another figure here what we know that means today. But these are actual effects that keep carrying on one generation to the next. And we believe, based on studies with other organisms, that it's likely that these epigenetic changes will still continue even to the next generation. So you notice that text to the second and third generation. Well, things that happen, things that a person does in one generation might change their epigenetic inheritance. It gets passed on, and the next generation may, in fact, continue with those same changes to their genes, to the expression of their genes, so that they continue to carry on what their parents did. So it's not like punishing. It's just that's the way genetics works. Now, interestingly enough, sometimes it's positive. Here's one case here up in the top. This is from the um, another hunger period in Sweden. And in this one, they studied not children that were in utero; they were actually infants during the famine. Now, infants that experience starvation, it turns out their children don't have have mild effects from that, but not a great deal. But their grandsons, it turns out they have a higher lifespan and better health for some strange reason. And so experiencing starvation as a child appears to actually add benefits to future generations. Experiencing it in utero brings about negative effects. So it's kind of interesting. This one's been less studied, but you've probably heard about intermittent fasting and some of those other things to increase a person's lifespan. They think there's some relationship with that in these kinds of cases. Second study in China, very much like we see for the Dutch hunger, also resulted in the you know lower lifespans. This group here also had lower lifespans, not shown in the figure, but down in the next generation. So the children, the grandchildren of this woman here are still experiencing decreased lifespans due to the changes because of this child having a mother who was starving while it was in utero. So these are things that get passed down from one generation to the next. And here's what it's about. So this is a picture of, here's a chromosome down here. So this is our chromosomes. And one of the things that happens to our chromosomes is during early development, a whole lot of chemical changes are done to some of the molecules that pack our DNA, these little things called histones. They get methylated here. There's a lot of chemical changes. And that is normal change. That's a normal type of change that helps our cells express genes appropriately. Different cells express different cells or different products, excuse me. So notice down here, see a liver cell makes different kinds of things than a neuron. And so the way the DNA gets packaged because of these chemical changes, those differences in expression then occur in those mature cells. And the DNA itself also gets modified. Notice there's little tiny red things added to the DNA here. So within genes, they get methylated, as it's called. And these methylation patterns represent epigenetic changes. These red little methyl groups that get added, they change how a gene is expressed. The more of these that get put on a gene, the less expressed the gene gets. The fewer of them, the more expressed the gene gets. And so cells can modify how much a gene is expressed by modifying how many of those methyl groups are added to the gene. And so what we now know or is happening during that starvation period when a child is in utero is that their genes are getting either more methylated in some cases or other genes are getting less methylated in response to the starvation the mother is experiencing. So the child's body is trying to adjust and it's doing these changes to the expression of its genes, trying to adjust to that starvation kind of scenario. And what they believe is that it's tweaking things for that child so that when it's born, it will seek out food more because, when you're in a famine, you need to find food. And so so their body tells them eat, eat, eat whenever you can. And you can see how that could eventually lead to metabolic disorders later in life. And so that process of adding or taking away methyl groups is getting disrupted. The normal process is getting disrupted during these times when a child is experiencing this in utero. Specific examples of this now are known. And so the Dutch hunger studies back in the 70s and 80s, they suspected epigenetic changes, but being we didn't have a way to study the DNA well enough, they didn't know the details. So here's just a few examples, and I didn't want to overwhelm you too much, but I wanted to give you some very concrete examples. The first gene discovered to be undermethylated. So this is a gene that in these children, when they examine them, later in life, because they stay methylated the same way throughout their lifespan. This first gene that was undermethylated was one called the insulin-like growth factor 2 gene. Now that's interesting because this gene is key to growth and development and affects metabolic health. It affects how your insulin response takes place later in life. And so by undermethylating this, meaning that this gene will now get overexpressed, that's going to tip the scales and cause a person to be more likely to be obese and to eat higher calorie foods and so on. And this is something the person isn't consciously, doing. It's just that's what their body says to do. And their body metabolically is adjusting in such a way that that person develops more problems with cardiovascular disease and so on. Now, there are also other methylation changes. Later DNA methylation between exposed and unexposed siblings were observed for several other genes. I'll give you a list there. All of those, by the way, are ones that are involved in growth and metabolic regulation. So DNA methylation was affected by prenatal exposure to the Dutch famine, leading to higher incidence of metabolic disorders in adulthood. So people in that next generation were finding that they had higher incidences. If they were children that were born, in other words, or were conceived during that famine, they ran a higher chance of having these diseases. And one last one, changes in DNA methylation in the PIM3 gene involved in energy metabolism was partly responsible. They could measure this. There was a noticeable increase in obesity in people that had changes in the methylation in that specific gene. And so we now have the smoking gun, so to speak, of what is causing this. And we now know for many, many other things, not just the Dutch hunger stuff and other hunger studies, but prenatal exposure to cigarette smoke, and to alcohol, both change methylation patterns in children born to parents who smoke or drink. Prenatal exposure to stress. Mm-hmm. A mother may be, in a abusive marriage. That's going to affect the unborn child. And it turns out that children that are born to mothers that are under extreme stress, those children have methylation changes that increase their anxiety levels throughout their lifespan often. Mm-hmm. And that leads to greater levels of depression often in those children as well. Maternal obesity leads to epigenetic changes in the fetus that lead to obesity in the child later in life. And so that causes problems. Now, it's not just prenatal. I should point out that childhood trauma, a child experiences trauma during their early lifespan, there is some change even then in the methylation patterns and then children become much more anxious and much more prone to depression as a result of that early trauma. And their bodies are like ultra sensitive to problems then later in life, and they have a lot less ability to manage life troubles as they continue. Childhood obesity tends to lead to later obesity because it also causes epigenetic changes even during early childhood. So some epigenetic change can even occur after birth, and it can be passed on to later in life and to the children then too. So what that tells you is that text where God says, okay, the parents do this and I'm punishing the children and the grandchildren. Well, it's genetics. If a parent does certain things, has certain problems, yeah, those are going to cause epigenetic changes that then will be passed on, and the children will tend to do those very same kinds of things. And so, yes, it's just normal biology. Okay, the last one, and I want to finish here before 11:30, so we have a good amount of time to discuss some of this. This is the text from Matthew that I mentioned was the LGBT kind of go-to text, which is a really great text. This is Jesus speaking here. And he says, for some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. And I love that last phrase. What does that mean? One who can accept this should accept it. Well, we'll talk about that. What do we think it means? But I want to focus on that first part. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way. Now, this is no surprise probably to most of you, and if you've been to another of my Sabbath seminars where I talked more specifically about LGBT individuals and genetics, you will already be familiar with this, that not everybody's born clearly male or female, or clearly a variety of other things. And so, for example, there's hermaphroditism, which is really pseudo-hermaphroditism, somebody who's born with parts of both male and female, both female and male parts. They probably don't function, but they're there. So we have children born that way. We have children born intersex. They're not clearly one sex or the other. Okay. So they're born because they have a genetic, they have certain alleles that lead to this intersex condition. Oh, I just noticed, Lauren, you had your hand raised. It may have been for a while because I wasn't paying attention. Did you have a question, comment?
No, I
Oh,
am.
okay.
I'm ready for the discussion when you finish here.
Okay. Good enough. Okay, so I'll keep going. And then, of course, people that are transsexual, um, they're born, they may be male, but their brain tells them they're female. And that, even though we don't know the underlying genetic reasons for this, there are clear reasons why this is suspected, and almost certainly is, that a certain number of people in that category clearly have some genetic something going on. We just don't know what yet. And I'll show you why we don't in a moment. Homosexual, bisexual, same thing, non-binary. So these are all categories of people. And I think when we look at this text, that's what in Jesus' day would have been the eunuchs that were born that way. Mm-hmm. They were people that didn't fit the standard sexual categories, gender categories. Okay, so he's addressing that. And then I love it. He says, the one who can accept this should accept it. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's we get there. Let's talk about it. Let me just show you how sex is determined. Because another thing I often hear from people is say, "Oh, but males and females are so different from each other." And yeah, they are. But you know what? We all start the same. So if you look at this developmental pathway here from the very earliest stage, notice this thing that says genital ridge. This is the early stage of sexual organ development. And you know what? Every baby has this. Exactly right there. This little tiny group of cells. It is a non-specific set of gonads, essentially. Okay, it's called the genital ridge. And notice it says bipotential gonad because it's not male, it's not female. It can go either way. Now, it turns out there is a gene, and it's located on the Y chromosome, interestingly enough, which is probably the reason why if you have a Y chromosome, you become male. The Y chromosome has this gene called the SRY gene. Now, the SRY gene is what we refer to as a kind of a genetic switch. It produces a DNA binding protein that turns on a whole bunch of other genes. One of the key genes that it turns on in its series of genes that it affects is this one called SOX9. And if you do much research out there on genetic development of sex, this gene pops up all the time. It's kind of the central gene after the SRY. And it influences other genes and a whole bunch of other complex things, and I'll show you the complexity here in a moment. But that now develops the testes, and this person will develop as male. And that's our typical development as a male. If you have the SRY gene, you're going to develop as a male, and you will have testes and all the other secondary sex characteristics that we normally expect. Now, if you don't have your SRY gene, notice your SRY minus, as this shows here, then you develop as female. And for females, they actually still have the SOX9 gene out there, and it even gets somewhat expressed, but it's not responded to, by the way. So even though it's there, it's not doing anything because it doesn't have other things to interact with. So here it is. These are the ones, though, that interact now. The SRY gene turns on Wnt4 and RSPO1 and some other things, and that develops into female development. And so a person who's SRY minus, usually XX, having two X chromosomes, they are going to be completely female. Now, the reason we found this gene, by the way, is because there were a few, historically, there were a few women born that were XY. And of course, the immediate question was, wait a minute, everybody just assumed that Y chromosomes determine sex, so how can they be XY and be female? Well, some of those, and not all of them, but some of them, it turned out, had a deletion on a part of the Y chromosome that just so happened to have deleted the SRY gene. And so it was missing. And so even though they were XY, they developed as female because they were SRY minus. So the Y chromosome itself is irrelevant. It's actually this gene on the Y chromosome that is super important in terms of sexual development. So that's all, and that's it, folks. As far as the gonads are concerned, they are the same until acted on by this gene, and then they differentiate into the two different forms, either an ovary or testes. And so we truly do have common roots. Both women and men have common roots in terms of their development of their sex organs. So, live with that. And now here's the more complex explanation. This is now showing a little bit of the steps that lead down there. Notice again, you can see that the SRY gene is right there. There are some other genes leading up to the bipotential gonad, and that's what this one shows. So there's a whole bunch of other genes, all very complexly involved in the development of this bipotential gonad. There are occasionally children born without gonads at all because something went wrong up here. And so that can also, and those are intersex individuals because they're not defined gender-wise at all in terms of their sex organs. So that can also happen. And then you see some other genes listed here. Now this is a more complete explanation. Let me give you the full one. And this is just to dazzle you because you're not going to make any sense out of it. There it is. Okay, this is the complexity of what makes a person either male or female. Okay, this one actually is showing for males. Notice the title here says SRY direct binding target gene. So remember I told you that the SRY gene was a DNA binding protein. It binds to a portion of other genes and turns them on. Well, there they are.
It's the simple view.
Yeah, and yeah. My wife just whispered to me, "This is a simple view." Yes, this is the simple view. I'm sorry, this is the best we could do. But that goes to show you that there's just a lot of complexity, and this is why when I say that we do believe, most geneticists do believe that trans people, for example, do have genetic reasons why they're that way. We just don't know what they are because the complexity here is such that we can't track down any one thing, and so it may be different things for different people, but there's clearly something genetic going on. So at any rate, that's it. And so I want to finish then with some questions. And this is what I want to use our time to discuss. And certainly if you have other things to bring up that's related, this is great too. But these are the questions for me as a geneticist. When I read the Bible and I've gone through, some of these things that I have, these are things that come up. If many behavioral traits are so heritable, how responsible is an individual for their own behavior? How should Christians relate to things like mental illness or addiction? And what about lifestyle issues like obesity? I mean, I've heard people say, I don't want to pay, have universal health care and pay for people who choose to be overweight and get, heart disease. And I've always said, well, are they choosing that? I mean, or in fact, there's a lot of evidence now that people that have problems with morbid obesity may in fact have metabolic disorders that are genetically based or based on their biome in their gut, all the bacteria that live there and stuff. It may not be them.
Medication.
And so medication may be required or surgery, some of the surgeries we do and so on. So, I mean, how do we relate to that? And I want to add to that, by the way, behavioral traits. Remember I said that political party affiliation is also highly heritable? Okay, so does that mean that I need to give some space for people that behave that way too? Because they behave the way they do because, they've got some of that. So can we come together and agree that we have to give each other some space and some grace? Okay, so that's to think about. Given the complexity of sexual determination and gender identification, how should the church relate to those who are intersexual or transgender? Yeah, and transgender is a big issue right now. We see it in our country. People want to really stop it. They don't want transgender people. They don't think it's right, and they want to make sure nobody is allowed to be transgender in some of our states. And certainly many in the church don't believe that it's okay, that gender's, something God created. So can't do that. Now, if as geneticists currently believe sexual orientation is at least partly based on genetics, as well as prenatal conditions in utero, and that's, by the way, the prenatal conditions in utero, we know that levels of testosterone do affect a fetus. whether it's a male or female fetus. There are effects from that, and some of them may have to do with sexual orientation. So how should the church view then homosexuality, knowing that it really is not a choice for many people that are they're gay? They didn't choose that. They were born that way because of it. And then lastly, considering that almost everything about us is a combination of genetic and environmental influences, how should we view personal responsibility for life choices? And how do we then, with grace, deal with the people in our church as we look at that? So that's what I wanted to share today, and hopefully stimulate some conversation around those questions, given what I've shared with you about the genetics. And so anyway, that's all I need to say, and I will only comment when needed now.
Right. Thank you so much. I find myself just fascinated by the whole thing, and we do have a couple of hands already, so let's see what people are thinking. Dr. Hemmings, I'm delighted that you're here to start us off. I'm sure you have a provocative question for Bryan this afternoon.
Well, I hope she has more than questions. She has to have answers too.
Yeah, well, you did say, come in while you're talking. So while you were talking about the SRY
Mhm.
factor that determines gender, I got it in very layman terms that we were all females first.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
from there, so how did it come in that way? Could it, because I did, from your explanation, it was quite, it didn't give any such indication. So
Right. Well,
why do they say we were all females first?
yeah, that's kind of probably not the right way to say it. What we are is that we're by default female.
Default female.
Yeah,
Okay,
by default. So in other words, if nothing else happens, you're going to be a female. But if you have the SRY gene, you'll be a male.
okay,
So that's why people will say that. It's kind of probably not the best way to say it, that we all start female. We all start with the potential to be either, is what is probably what we ought to say. But if nothing else happens, if the SRY gene doesn't do its thing, yeah, you're female.
yeah.
That's what you're going to be.
So
Yeah.
I was going to follow up on that, and
Mhm.
I want to go back to, because I was very interested in the second question you posed at the end.
Mhm.
And I don't know, perhaps, it's related there, because we have a Genesis account of creation that, even
Mhm.
though a lot of people may challenge the 7-day creation story, including Adventist scientists, most of whom are males, they don't challenge the question as to a female coming from a male person. We don't have any biological or anything in geology and research anywhere to indicate that possibility.
Mhm.
And so, I'm just, I just wanted to throw that out there to you, because I look at the Genesis story as a story of, as an etiology, if you may call it so,
Mhm.
explaining why things are the way they are. And to me, this woman coming from man is a way of explaining a patriarchal system and justifying males ruling over females. I just know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because, there's a lot of theology around the creation of Eve and what that meant. And I think sometimes Eve was made out of Adam's side, right? That was kind of how it's described. And um, from a genetic perspective, let me just say this, okay? If you're going to make a woman from a man, what are you going to be doing there? If you're doing the genetics, right? Well, you got to take two copies of the X chromosome instead of an X and Y. So, all that sort of thing. But I think in terms of the patriarchy, that's a separate issue. I think the real question at the creation is, does that say that there's only male and female, and that those that are male and those that are female have to be that, and they can't, there's no other way around it. In other words, if I'm born a male, I can't decide I'm female, gender, because that's the creation story doesn't allow for that. And what I would say, I guess, to that is that I don't think that that was the intention at all, because they didn't even understand that concept, most likely. Now, that's not to say there were probably trans people in the Bible. I think there probably were, but they wouldn't have called them that. And they obviously couldn't really quote transition. They would have been, by the New Testament, when Jesus made his statement, they would have been eunuchs. They would have been that type of person. And I think they didn't know what to do with them. And that's why I think when we look at modern genetics, we have maybe now we have the ability to decide what to do,
Yeah.
and maybe get past what we think the Bible was trying to teach there, instead of just assuming that that's what it means. But really, I don't
Yes.
have that's such a contentious issue. I mean, what does it mean? And in fact, we get even the headship concept comes out of that creation story, which I believe is a big misinterpretation of the story. But nevertheless, there are serious theologians. That's what they do with that. They take the story and they get patriarchy out of it, and that's sad to me that they do that. Because I think the story really, if you look at it deeply, it was saying that Adam and Eve were equal, and that there wasn't, neither was better than the other. She was to be a helpmeet. That was a partner, equal on equal terms. But yeah, you bring up a very, very sticky question.
Maybe for another discussion.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Olive. Thank you very much. It does really kind of make you wonder, doesn't it, Olive, if we understood even more about this genetic process than we do today, if perhaps God had something entirely different in mind about Eve and what her purpose was. It might be very enlightening. But in any case, we come to my dear friend, Jerry Lofthouse. Jerry, tell us what you're thinking this afternoon, questions you have for Bryan.
Well, I'm thinking something that Bryan chose not to go into, but maybe I'll drag it out of him a little bit. And perhaps
go ahead. Yeah.
So, Bryan, I really appreciate the presentation. Its background is powerful. I accept all these things as fact, as they're laws of physics, and I think that's true. But I want to bring up the Deuteronomy statement and ask about what I have always sort of assumed as an implied reversion. After the third and fourth generation, what happens? Well, he didn't say to the 12th generation or to the rest of your generations. And I've always taken it to believe that, well, perhaps they would revert toward the norm after those third and fourth generations. Is there any science to help us see that as an option?
Yeah, actually there is. Although we don't know enough about epigenetics to be sure how that sorts out in humans. It varies in the animal models that have been studied. I know that there's this little thing called Cenorhabditis elegans. It's a little roundworm that a lot of epigenetic studies have been done in, and they have found that in the roundworm, that even 12 generations later, there's some residual epigenetic markers that remain. But then they've looked at other animals. I think it's in mice. They seem to start receding after several generations. So it does appear that, and rewriting is possible. And one thing I didn't mention in my presentation is that there are researchers out there trying to think of could we rewrite some of this, some of these epigenetic changes, because it's just those methyl groups, right? You're just adding, methyl groups to the genes. Could we add some? Could we take some away? The issue is, though, we don't know enough at this point about, well, where would we want to add them? Where would we want to take them away? And how do we target it? And that's the real tough part. Yeah.
Right. The question in my mind, it brings up some of what I think we will eventually talk about more here this morning. And that's the effect on choice that has to do with religion and our implications about guilt and evil. Because if there's reversion, then I have the potential to come out of this. I have the potential to be influenced by my surroundings, by my maker, by good and bad people around me, independent of these genes themselves. So I think that has a lot of possibility for my future.
Yeah. Well, and let me just say add one thing to that.
Do for a living.
We know that that during a person's lifetime, some degree of epigenetic rewriting occurs. So let's say we talked about the child who's experienced trauma, and some of his epigenetic changes cause their nervous system to be more sensitive as a result, and so they're dealing with higher anxiety levels and so on. There is evidence that through things like therapy or even some medication and so on and so forth, and adaptation, that some of that can get rewritten. It doesn't get completely done, and it certainly probably gets rewritten over later generations. And so that passing it on, and I think that's why in that text it does mention third and fourth generation, doesn't go any deeper because it does start to erode a little bit over the generations. And if you read the text a little further, it also says that if people return to God or whatever, that he's
Right.
also forgiving.
Sure.
But that of course implies the person can do that, and that's your question of choice. I mean, do we really have those choices sometimes?
Right.
And that's the tough one. In fact, some of you may know that psychologists even question whether people have, personal choice in a lot of things we do, or do we just react? So,
Good.
yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Help.
Thanks, Jerry. Appreciate it. Ray and Bobby, I'm glad to see you all sitting together. I've been a little bit troubled when I've seen you in separate boxes in recent weeks. So I'm glad you
Oh,
all
by
are
the way,
together.
I have my wife here too.
See that? So what are you guys thinking?
Well, one's an observation and the other's a question. When you asked, what should the church GC do about the question of homosexuality? Well, they've already answered that. In their website on human sexuality, they have a little disclaimer there. We ignored all science and went by the Bible only. So there's your answer.
Yeah.
Two,
Yeah, and that's GC, right? I mean,
that's on their
yeah, because the North American division had put out a other statement earlier, but it does seem like the GC's ignored that. And
they
yeah,
just so
let's move
what
forward.
you have to say or
Mhm.
think or reality is not important.
Yeah.
In the Bible,
Mhm.
it didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
But anyway, the question I had was going back to Adam and Eve and Cain,
Hmm.
how many generations would it took or have taken for there enough people to be in this land of Nod that
Hmm.
Cain was already afraid of? I mean, that
Hmm.
suggests there was a large
Mhm.
number of people already existing.
Yep.
And where is this land of Nod?
Yeah,
mean-
and that's the further question. Yeah.
So when you talk about how many generations would it took to produce enough people to
Yeah.
essentially start another race or group?
And was his wife a Neanderthal?
Yeah. Yeah, well, there you go. Or what should I say? It would be Heidelbergensis. That was supposed to be the earliest of the human types or something. There's some have speculated about that. Obviously, if you go the route of saying Cain had to marry somebody that wasn't, in his immediate family, you are bringing up the question of were Adam and Eve the first people? And so, I've carefully stayed away from that because that's another discussion, but it is part of it. I mean, we have to ask that question. Um, were Adam and Eve were they the only ones that existed? I mean, how does that work? And I did have a talk about that about a year or so ago about that, and that's a tough one. But I think the consanguineous problem, and you mentioned how many generations. Well, what if you start with just a couple anyway? I mean, how do you build up any kind of genetic variability um, such that you have a viable population? And those are questions that, from a genetics perspective, just don't work. And so that's why a lot of modern scholars have been a little more open to the idea that maybe Adam and Eve weren't the only created beings. That God had more out there.
Well, doesn't that also impact all of your other stories when people
Mhm.
like to count the generations and say, well, it's only been 6,000 years?
Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
you left out truckloads of people.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. So that does open a can of worms, so to speak, and that's the
Oh,
unfortunate thing when you do science. You open up some doors and some questions that maybe not are not comfortable,
Mhm.
um, because
so
they challenge
genetics
your original
does
story.
impact theology.
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
And I've been told, oh, you're not a theologian. Well, it's fine. I'll give
Of
you the problem.
course.
You solve it for me. Give it to
Yeah,
the theologian.
most of those materials on sexuality were written by theologians and not
Yeah,
scientists.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I wish, I mean, I've had conversations with theologians, and there are theologians that actually like some of the things that I suggest, but when you're up against the larger church, and this is the thing, I think when I my personal experience, and I don't know, Lauren can maybe help me here too, or Chris, I think there's a lot of Adventist leaders that actually would like to see the church be more friendly to LGBT people. But there's a certain loud chunk of people down there, from the GC and other places that simply everybody's afraid of crossing, and I think rightly so. So
fear,
it just keeps us stuck. Yeah.
fear.
So, yeah, but I do think there are others. It's just how do they speak up? Because there's this fear, of losing their job or position or influence or whatever it may be. So, yeah.
Lots of questions. And the dialogue is interesting. Thank you. Thank you, Ray and Bobby, for your thoughts. Uh, Robert, I'm coming to you and going to ask you to unmute. What are your questions for Bryan this afternoon, today?
I listened with interest to your presentation, and you mentioned how mothers during the famine or mothers who are alcoholics can pass these characteristics on. Now, I used to be a school teacher, and I had students who had fetal alcohol syndrome.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
also, where the mothers had smoked, it seemed that the children had a little more difficult time learning. But I'm
Mhm.
always curious about the fathers. They seem to get off scot-free. What if the father is an alcoholic, or what if he is smoking at the time of conception? Does he pass something on? Has any research been done?
Yes, yes. And the answer is emphatically yes. There have been studies showing that fathers that smoke, for example, do pass on epigenetic changes. Now, keep in mind that a child who's born to a mother who is smoking or is drinking has two things against them. One is there's going to be epigenetic changes, and the other is just being in that environment where they're being exposed in utero to those chemicals. So, I mean, there's two effects, and so it's obviously worse if the mother is, but the father does pass on stuff too, and it's in the sperm. I mean, because those
Hmm.
epigenetic changes that have occurred in him because he's a smoker end up then being passed into his sperm, which the child then inherits when they're conceived. So yes, most definitely, fathers should not be let off the hook. In fact, I think fathers are let off the hook on all kinds of ways because we often talk about, oh, men that are 80 years old can father a child, but you know what? They have more mutations in their sperm by that age, just like women have more mutations in their eggs when they're around 40. I mean, so it's not a risk-free sort of thing. And both the father and mother can certainly pass on some problems, and epigenetic changes are one of them. So yes, most definitely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Thank you so much. Lauren, you're up.
This has been marvelous. Thank you, Bryan. Uh,
Yeah.
Fascinated by this. When we were in college, or maybe this was in the academy, because the memory isn't very clear, but I do remember something about a chap named Lamarck who cut off the tails of mice for a number of generations, and the mice kept being bored with tails anyway. And that was a simplification, I believe, of what Lamarck actually taught, but that's how they told it to us.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, this fascinates me that, in fact, trauma, starvation, things like that can be passed along. And there are some of us, Chris Widmer and I were just talking about that.
who came from a line of people who were rather beleaguered uh, uh, immigrants and struggled a bit, and wonder how it affects us today. But I've got to tell you this story. When you said even the political party is affected through genetics. I've run into this 2 or 3 times, but this one is very vivid to me. A man who was a very conservative Seventh Adventist, and he thought he was the very first Seventh Adventist in his family. He had discovered it in college by picking up a brochure to an evangelistic meeting. And it wasn't until he was older that his mother admitted to him that, yes, I had been raised a Seventh Adventist. I married a man who wasn't. I set it aside. I never told you kids about it at all. And here he grows up, discovers it for himself without anybody ever saying it. And there is something about this whole set of beliefs that just grabbed onto him the moment he heard it. And he became a very conservative fundamentalist Seventh Adventist. I found that fascinating. Some of us inherited it much more directly than that. We were taught it. It was given to us in words. And in some way, in our genetics, it wasn't quite as comfortable as it was to this guy who had never been taught it. He just grabbed onto it. It was who he was when he picked up that brochure. And I find that just fascinating, how these qualities just seem to be built into certain people. Anyway, that's
that tendency to conservatism, for example, and that's kind of what that's about.
Mm-hmm.
And we sometimes talk about tribes, and there is some from the heritability studies, there's evidence that tribalism, the tribes that we are in, are somewhat defined, based on that on genetics. Not completely, of course, because obviously people do leave their tribes too.
The preference for a set of rules.
My wife said preference for a set of rules. If you want black and white thinking, and that's something else that maybe kind of inborn to a degree. But that's why I say we have to have grace.
He probably could have found himself comfortable as a Mormon or something else too.
Yeah.
That had a similar sort of rigidity. But it's fascinating to me that he discovered the Seventh Adventist Church without ever being told about it until later. His mother said, well, yeah, I was one too, but I rejected it when I was young, and I never told you kids about it. Fascinating.
So some attracted her too, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. At one point it did.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I see Elmer and Dorothy Capino. Welcome and join the conversation, please.
Oh, okay.
We have enjoyed this presentation very much, but we would like to know, how do we get a copy of the video or a copy of the program, if that's at all possible, since it is being taped?
Are you asking
Laura needs a copy.
Dorothy and Elmer, we have a YouTube channel, and every week we post the videos, and that includes the presentation and everything, if that's what you're asking about.
Yes, it is. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll post the YouTube link in the chat right now, just as a reminder.
Thank you.
However, it's also every Sabbath when we have our editorial, we have that link in there. We have the same link in our announcement for every meeting. If you just look down, it'll show you where the YouTube channel is too, and we put up almost every one of them.
Thank you. This was in response to the question of how are these recordings accessed after the fact. So thank you for the question, and thank you.
I will put that in the chat right now.
Yes, thank you.
Laura, I'm going to raise my hand before anybody else, because my wife wanted to say something, and she doesn't have a separate way to do it.
Absolutely. Wait.
So yeah.
I just wanted to say something about counseling, about therapy, because I am a therapist. That's what I do for my career and have been working with people for 25 years with things. And so therapy does give us one way of addressing those personal brands of genetics, epigenetics, tendencies, weaknesses. And so in counseling, one of the things we do is look at what are people's collection of strengths and weaknesses. How can we help people learn how to calm their nervous system and kind of retrain that? Medication might be helpful. And in areas where we can see maybe there is a genetic predisposition to things like obesity, for example. And if food is being engineered to make it more craveable and more desirable, some people may not be able to resist it. And so I kind of can see where things like some of the new medications that are being used, I know there's a lot of discussion about Ozempic, but I'm kind of looking at where this could go because this has the possibility to start retraining us and helping us move in a healthier direction with our health and with our nervous systems. Even doing trauma work with clients, I believe there are things that we can do to actually help start healing some of those changes that can lead to really unhealthy things. So there are things that we can do, and certainly people's spirituality can be a huge part of that. It can be it's partly why we have prayer and meditation, because those things can help calm and retrain a nervous system. And there is some research even that would suggest it can increase the methylation that Bryan was talking about. And so we do have some ability, even though these genetic and epigenetic things may be kind of ingrained in us from birth and may continue to be weaknesses. I don't want you to feel like there's not anything we can do about it, because there are things we can do through the generations to move things in a healthier direction with that.
Yeah, and as you said, that some of the rewriting of epigenetic changes is possible. I mean, we do see some of that from things like therapy and medication and so on. And you know what the good thing about that is if you do your trauma work as a person, as an adult, before you have children, you won't pass it on as much to your children then. so there we go. We can shortchange the under the third and fourth generation a little bit.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Ness. We appreciate it. Lawrence, we come to you. What are your thoughts this afternoon?
Yes, thank you. Bryan, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation in which I learned quite a lot. And with my aging brain, maybe too much for me to take in. Now, after that sort of generous introduction, you might sense there's a but, about to come. But I'd like to go back to Deuteronomy 5 and the statement about the third and fourth generation, and a couple of comments I want to make on the verses there. One sociological, the other one more to do with Hebrew idiom. The first of them is this, that in the West, and even more so in some Western countries than others, we think very individualistically. The Hebrews didn't think individualistically. And whereas in our societies, generally speaking, the basic building block of society is me, or a nuclear family. In Israel, the major building block of society was the extended family. And so the extended family, being the major building block of society, was usually composed of 3 and sometimes 4 generations. So when Deuteronomy 5 talks about people turning their back on the covenant and acting unrighteously, and that having an effect on the 3rd and 4th generation, it's an idiomatic way of speaking about the extended family, not the 3rd and 4th generations yet unborn, but when I sin, it's not just my business, brother, it affects other people too. And if we read it absolutely literally, because there's a part of the verse I think you omitted, probably because you didn't have room for it on your slide, all right? But after saying that it talks about the 3rd and 4th generation of those who reject me will have negative consequences. That's expressed, in a Hebrew style, which is more robust, than modern English. It then says, but showing steadfast love to the 1000th generation of those who love me. Now, if we take that literally, the statement self-destructs, because let's say I am a righteous fellow. If you can be really imaginative, and you can consider that I'm a really righteous fellow. I'm kind to my wife. I help old ladies across the road. I'm good with dumb animals. I'm a really great fellow. It means that 1,000 generations from now, my 1,000th generation from now will be benefiting from my righteousness. So if my great-grandson is as evil as King Manasseh, well, it's not going to have any impact whatsoever on his children, because my righteousness is good for 1,000 generations. It's not going to affect anybody. And that is obviously nonsense. So I'd say that we need to understand the verse more sociologically, idiomatically. This isn't to say anything against what you've said about genetics, which I take, and since I'm speaking, let me just say one more thing, which is about Cain and his wife and the land of Nod. When we read that story, as we've seen today with people's questions, if we read the story literally, all kinds of problems arise when we read the story. Maybe that should be an indication to us about what kind of a story we've got, if reading it literalistically creates all kinds of problems. And for example, the land of Nod, I'm going to finish now, sorry. The land of Nod in Hebrew, Nod means wandering, aimlessness. It isn't a point on the map. It's a description of Cain's inner state. From now on, he's living an aimless, wandering, vagabond kind of existence. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, and Lawrence, I was going to say, I appreciate your comment about the individual versus the family system, because I think sometimes our Western culture doesn't realize how focusing too much on the individual also is to our detriment. And it does help us to forget that one generation does affect other generations, and that's inherent. Actually, not even affect, but is responsible for other generations. That's what you would get from that family system in the East. So that's a good point. As far as the literalness of the Cain story, and that's the big question, isn't it, for Genesis? How much should we take literal, and how much should we take some other way? And I guess are we free to explore that way as much? And I don't know that we often are given that opportunity. So I'd love to hear more thoughts on some of that at some time, if you get the chance. I don't know if you have any other comments on that particular one, the literalness versus figurativeness, I guess.
Yes. Again, more questions than answers, perhaps.
Yeah. No, exactly. And that's the one is I love and I love that the land of Nod, the land of wandering. I've heard that before, and that's a good point. So yeah.
Well, Chris, we're glad to see you. Are you playing hooky today?
Yes, I am playing hooky today. I'm exhausted from my trip to. I put the space background on here because we were just down at Cape Canaveral at the Visitor Center last week and got to see the documentary on the Webb telescope, which can see farther out into space than man has ever seen before. I think, first of all, is a comment and then a question on a Bible story you didn't mention today, Bryan, and that is the Adventist Church has made no statement about intersex that I have found in my last 13 years. And I think it's because they can't admit that intersex is a biological reality of human existence. Because then it would open up the door to, well, if there's intersex of the body, genitalia at birth, and there's intersex of the mind, which would lead to transgender acceptance, and that might lead to that maybe there's a genetic factor for homosexuality and same-sex behavior, and their whole house of cards would come crumbling down. There was a really good article in Spectrum magazine in 2012, which brought a lot of comfort to me. It's by Rich Hannon, Adventist and the Intersex Problem, which is worthwhile to read. The Bible story that we kind of mentioned in presentations Debbie and I made last weekend, and that's a hint as to what we were doing out of state, is the story of Jacob and Esau, two fraternal twins born so totally different. And the Bible makes a really big point about how different they were. One was smooth, one was hairy, one was a man of the outdoors, a manly man going out shooting animals. The other one, could slaughter goats and was really good with goats, which you mentioned. Just maybe a comment on that as it relates to genetics and the difference of how two people from the same gene pool can be so different.
Yeah, well, that would take an extended description of things, but the point is that we have a thing going on called recombination. And if you think about this, every one of us is a complex mixture of our grandparents through our parents. And it's amazing how mixing and matching can result in some very, very different offspring. So there's, this is a good counter, by the way, to the whole thing about heritability. Heritability makes it sound like, oh, you got this, you're going to get that. Well, that's statistically so. So, it's like 50% heritability. Well, 50% of them didn't get that, right? 50% got it, 50% didn't. So there's a lot of randomness built into the genetic system, so that each child is going to be unique. And there's just an example of that. And I think my wife would probably agree that in her family that kind of happened with her too. She and her brothers, they often say they're different species because they're totally different behavior approaches to life and everything else. And I would say our two kids, similar thing. I mean, they just are seem like they're from different families, but they're who they are. Of course, they got different fathers in that case, so that was a little bit. But the same father and mother, yeah, you can produce quite the variety. So we call it recombination, though, and that's what you get.
Thank you.
Yeah. And by the way, I wanted to one other comment I was going to make. You mentioned, what was your first comment about? Just to remind me, it was
Adventist and intersex. They don't talk about.
Yes. Right. And yeah, and I think you're right. I don't think they've ever addressed that precisely. And I think anytime I've kind of sort of pushed a little bit on that, I got the sense, but there's hardly anybody born that way. So it's like they feel like that's just a small number of people that it's not, you don't need to, but that's to me, that's just unkind, Oh, so there's only a few people like that, so we don't have to worry about it.
Well, and we don't have anybody like that in our church, because when somebody's born intersex, usually the doctor says, well, let's do surgery, raise them as a girl, all will be fine, and life will go on. And it's like, don't tell anybody that this child was different, because nobody will know what to do, and it's just awful, so keep it a secret.
Yeah, and I know some intersex people, and you wouldn't know they are.
No.
And they don't tell anybody. They're not gonna. They don't let it out. So people get this sense, oh yeah, those people exist, but I don't know any of them, we don't have to deal with them often enough. So why do we need to worry about a policy or anything?
Well, that's the question I have for the church. Who, if you're going to insist that gay and lesbian people stay celibate, the question is and they recommend that transgender people stay the gender they were assigned. And then the question is, who should the intersex person marry? Would you declare that they also must stay single their life because they probably can't reproduce a child? Is the only purpose of marriage to have reproduce children? Is that the only purpose? Or is companionship important? And the church cannot address that question. It would be detrimental to their position.
Right. And the marriage question is that the immediate question comes up for people. Well, is it a heterosexual marriage? Well, I mean, what? Okay. How would I define that in this case? So there's where, and I think that people just aren't ready for that kind of making space. And that's what I wanted to argue for from my entire presentation in all aspects, is that we need to have more grace dealing with people that are different, that often they're different because of their epigenetic inheritance. So, a lot of that they can't really, change. So why can't we be more understanding of that? Because I think there's people on both sides, both liberals and conservatives, that will just, trash the other person on the other side because they're not going to behave the way that I think they should, when in fact we need to somehow come together and realize, well, we do behave differently. And I've got to make space for those that have these different ways of dealing with life and living in the world.
Well, the immediate response would be, what if I'm born with a predilection to pedophilia? Am I able to live that? They go to the extremes either way.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly.
And that would go with Ellen White's, declaration of people with inherited propensities to evil, and that the mind is the one that could transcend everything. So it's the mind over sexual drive. It's the mind over everything. Just tough it out, people. Be single.
Yeah. So I don't know. It's going to that extreme is what really I think hurts, and I think
to others and consent.
because if you're harming people, that's a different issue.
Well, and consent.
Exactly. The age of consent. It's like that child cannot consent. So
right.
Well, I don't know I don't know if they were prescient, but these comments have brought to my mind what Ira and George Gershwin wrote back in the late 1930s, the song, "It Ain't Necessarily So." The things that you're liable in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so.
So that's a good example.
Yeah.
And thank you, Chris. Did you have anything more to add?
Oh, that's good. Thank you for the presentation, and I'm glad I was here for it, and it didn't happen last week.
Yes, indeed. And before I go on to Ed, something that you said, Bryan, also calls to mind, that I noticed that in your name section in your block that you have your pronouns shown. And some people here might think you're just especially progressive or perhaps woke, depending on how one looks at it. But I thought it might interest you to know, and perhaps others as well, that in a seminar presentation I heard this week by a significant law firm in the area of employment and labor law, that the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Department of Labor have come out with some new rules on harassment guidelines, and that employers are actually required to allow people to use the pronouns that they specify for themselves, and also to have access to bathrooms where they relate. Now, of course, we all know there's going to be religious upheaval and requests for exemptions, and I guess people who need those exemptions probably don't work for the General Conference or for the church in an identified capacity. But I just thought I thought you'd like to know that you're compliant. You're right there.
Yeah, I actually do it just because I want to make any LGBT people comfortable that I know, and there are ones that I know, and
why not? And why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. All right.
That's a way of signaling to them that I know, that I understand, where they are coming from, and they're free to be who they are. So, I mean, that's another thing I do too. If you're with me in person, I wear this on my wrist. It's actually surfer's bracelet, but it's you got all the colors, LGBT colors.
Okay.
And so it's just there because that way if a LGBT person sees me, they know, oh, that's somebody I can,
Friend.
I can talk to them.
Friend.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And
You've
it
been
may
said-
offend some other people, but well,
Well, I
yeah.
think someone who's been a Seventh-day Adventist as long as I have, it's always been a source of disappointment to me that our denomination is not, and it perhaps has been at times, but not in recent years, on the cusp of social justice and reform. And that's a real
Yeah.
source of sorrow and disappointment to me. But having
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
Ed, I'm happy to see you today. Share with us what you're thinking this afternoon.
Yes, thank you very much, Bryan. You've raised a lot of questions for me, and you've covered a lot of territory, and the chat shows that people appreciate what you've done here. So I have a question regarding aging. So it's sort of like a two-part question. So before the flood, it seems a lot of people lived hundreds of years. Now I don't know exactly, the statistics or anything. And then mankind became very evil. So listening to the genetic passing on of information or the DNA onto the further generations. So it would seem that after the flood was over, that the generations that came after that would live less. However, Noah and his family, who would then they were the parents of the new generations, weren't evil. So I'm just curious why, and again, I don't know all the specifics or details, but why people didn't live so long if they came from Noah, a righteous family. And fast forwarding to our current generations, and what Lawrence Turner brought up about, there's sort of a grace in that Deuteronomy text. And so the other question is related, is through our lifestyle, through our attitudes and various things we do, we can make changes to improve our aging process.
Yeah, and I think we talk about aging, and you notice the hunger studies that some of the generations after the famines, for example, when the children were in utero during that time, that they didn't live as long. So there's clearly some but those are epigenetic effects, and I think you're mixing also just regular genetics. And I know that in the Old Testament, that the ages of people, that's been a theological discussion of various sorts too, because some will say, well, those are ages that are typical of that time period that they put in there. That didn't mean they were that old. So I don't know in terms of the theology on that. But the other part of it, if we went from a genetics perspective, and let's assume that people did live longer before, and as sin affects everything, and one of the arguments is that sin causes mutations, and more mutations lead to shorter life. That would be probably the standard definition or the standard explanation for why ages gradually eroded, and we got to the point where we weren't living those really long ages that we see in the early parts of Genesis. What's interesting, if we look at modern populations, though, is most of you realize what was lifespan, life expectancy like in the 17th century, for example, compared to today. Well, it was a lot worse, right? And it's primarily because of we've learned a lot more about health and what to eat and not to eat, and we've got treatments for disease and so on. And so now lifespans have gone up again. They continue to fluctuate to some degree because not everybody is practicing the things that lead to long life. But we have seen increased lifespans due to some of those kind of changes. And I think some of those probably are going to be epigenetic. They get passed on to generation to generation. And so those who have longevity probably have some genes for that. They may pick up some other changes as they make lifestyle changes that also get passed on in the terms of epigenetics. So I think there's some influence there. as far as the under the 1000th generation, it almost sounds like that's an exaggeration, and I'm not sure if Florence, he kind of implied that, but I didn't quite get that from what he said. But it's maybe a bit of an exaggeration that if I'm righteous, 1000 generations, but certainly it can affect, some of the generations right soon after me. But I really, I don't know. I've always wondered what to do with those long ages in the Old Testament. Anyway, it's been one of those questions that, to my mind, did people really live that long, or was that somehow just the way they told the stories back then? And those are the ages that were typical of not just Hebrew culture, but other cultures in the area were also having genealogies with long ages like that as well. So I don't know if anybody else has something to add to that. That's because that's always an interesting topic, but I'm not as theologically adept at that particular topic. So I don't know if that answers it or not, but hopefully a little bit there.
Well, of course, we're in our modern economies around the world, or much of the world. There's all kinds of environmental, like chemicals, and all that kind of stuff.
And some cultures do not have the longer lifespans like ours does. Most definitely. Yeah. So we can certainly see the environment.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it. Hi, Gina. It's good to see you.
Thanks. Nice to see you, Linda.
What are you laughing at?
I'm kind of riffing off what.
I got a second comment in.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You're good. You're good, Gina.
Okay. I'm kind of riffing off what Chris Widmer was talking about earlier about transgender people and intersex people. We have something in common. We each have a transgender child. I watched an interesting TED Talk, and the opening line of it was a physician who was an endocrinologist, and his provocative opening line was, "What is the third word that anybody ever said about you?" I'm going to give you a minute to think about that. And it was, "It's a boy. It's a girl." How important is that? That was probably the first thing anybody ever said about you. And then his comment was, "But there are some people who do not fit into that category." He says, as a physician, I deal pretty frequently with people who are born intersex. And at the time they're born, the doctor will make a decision. Well, should it be a boy or should it be a girl? And we'll make the decision, and we cross our fingers that it will be the correct one, which maybe it wasn't if the child is born intersex. And that's often referred to as corrective surgery because we're very eager to normalize things. We do not have a category of intersex people, but in fact, people are born intersex. And you just think how much of that is part of our culture. I know I've seen some Adventist literature before that will talk about why transgender is bad, because there's a verse in Deuteronomy that talks about you shouldn't wear the clothing of the other gender. And they'll kind of go off and base a whole anti-transgender argument about that, which seems specious to me, actually.
Yeah.
But there
are. Oh, Gina, you froze. There. Are you back? We lost you there for a minute.
She must have some bandwidth issues.
Yeah, Gina, we got.
Well, you shouldn't have.
You're sort of going in and out.
Yeah, Linda, let me just respond to her a little bit while hopefully her connection gets back in shape. Good. Because the intersex, there's been a lot of change in the treatment of intersex babies over the last about 20 years.
You shouldn't change it for intersex.
And within the intersex community, there's been a push to accept them as intersex, and simply, that if you're born intersex, that's what I want to be. I want to be recognized as for what I am, and not be told I have to decide to be male or female. And part of that's the response to the fact that, yes, people made wrong wrong decisions in some cases. So a child was born and they did quotes corrective surgery, and as the child got older, they didn't feel that was the correct choice. It wasn't the gender that they themselves believed they were. And so the standard practice now, at least in most countries, the US, and I don't know if this would be true throughout the US, but they've tried to push for this, that at birth, there is no determination made. The child is left, unless there is a medical reason to do anything, they do not do corrective surgery. They leave it be, and they wait till the child has grown a while and gotten old enough to begin to also be a part of that decision as to what gender they see themselves as. And if they get to the point where they realize, well, I don't really want to pick a gender, I'm intersex, that's okay too. That's something the intersex community has really been pushing hard on. I don't know that outside of it, it's often not heard about. And so some of you may have never heard of that discussion, but that's the current thinking. And a lot of doctors are now beginning to reconsider this whole idea of corrective surgery. And it's not as popular as it once was, fortunately, I think, because it really is something that I think that the child themselves need to be able to contribute to later on when they're old enough to make that decision. So it shouldn't be left to the parents, in other words, and the doctors.
Gina, I'm showing you as unmuted. Are you able to speak? I can't see you.
I think I am. I've turned my picture off because I'm getting messages that say my internet is unstable and I got kicked off. So no picture now, but I'm still here.
Yeah. Yeah, we thought you were having bandwidth issues. That sounds like.
Yeah. So I just wanted to finish up a couple comments. I don't know if you heard the part about the argument people make about how you shouldn't alter someone genetically.
Yeah, and I don't know if you heard what I said to that. It might have fit right in with what you're talking about. You're there, Gina? Oh boy, she's having lots of problems, it sounds like.
Lots of problems. She's got lots of problems. I just wanted Gina to know when she said the third word that was said. Gina, the third word that my parents said when I was born was retarded. Apparently I was in the birth canal a long time. I had a pointed head. So they were, my college educated parents were deeply concerned. So,
oh no.
I'm sorry.
You were just a conehead.
I was a conehead. I was indeed. I'm sorry we got cut out. But I think Bryan just intuitively understood your questions and your points. Is there anything you want to add, Gina? I don't want to cut you short.
Oh, I was going to say I have a transgender child who we thought was a female, who told me from the time she was able to talk that she was a boy. And nobody knew about transgender, or it just was not a topic back in the early 1980s and wouldn't have discussed it. But interestingly, when he was in first grade, there was a boy in his class who had a birthday party that invited all the boys in his class and my child. His mother actually called me up and said, well, he's just inviting the boys, but he wants to include your daughter as well. And it just makes me wonder if reception or acceptance of transgender people is something that children can recognize that we've been conditioned not to recognize. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good story. Yeah.
Thanks for your personal experience. That means a lot. It really does. And some people may know because it's really she's never kept it a secret. But the famous actress, Jamie Lee Curtis, a beautiful person, was an intersex person at birth. You know, a physician made a decision about what she would become. And I guess it's worked out. But it does happen. It does happen. Clarence, I'm happy to see you this afternoon. What are you thinking about this discussion?
Glad to see you too, and thanks to Bryan for this beautiful and well-thought presentation. Now, class, I must confess I have some disturbing questions. I ask you to bear with me. And since I am not in your direct physical presence, I suppose I have nothing to fear. But let me say this. First of all, on the matter of the long ages, somebody mentioned why is it some people live so long? I personally think that it is, for me, it's obvious that the Genesis account follows the Sumerian Babylonian accounts, in which people lived for almost millions of years, thousands and thousands of years, not millions, but thousands and thousands. And so Genesis simply follows that and toned it down and gave them up to almost 1,000. And since a day with the Lord is 1,000 years, as a rabbi once said, none of them lived for one theological day. They all died before one day of the Lord. They didn't live it out. And so that settles it. But on some of the other questions, let me say this. What we now understand about human evolution says that there was no Cain and no Abel, period. Cain and Abel, as presented in the biblical text, simply did not exist. Okay? My next question then is, how do we accommodate evolution to the first 11 chapters of Genesis? I suspect that we are all afraid to bite the bullet. We keep shying away from it.
It's not.
How long can we do that? It keeps staring us in the face. So it seems to me again that all religions with a creator God now have to sit down, think things over, and determine where do we go from there to keep the faith. That is essential. We want to keep the faith, but we don't want to turn out to be ignoramuses, ignorant people who are just saying any kind of old thing. We don't want to be that. We want to keep the faith, but we want to be intelligent people living in an intelligent, educated world. How do we do that? On the LGBTQ question, it seems to me that we have by and large, especially in this class, we have all accepted or reconciled to the fact that we cannot follow the biblical injunction. Because if you follow the Bible, you'll do like what GC says. We only follow the Bible. We didn't bother with science, or we didn't bother with sociology. We simply followed the Bible, okay? So we here are willing not to follow the Bible on LGBTQ. I agree with that, essentially. Why don't we apply the same thinking, the same mentality, the same disposition to Genesis? Why are we afraid to bite the bullet? Somebody, please give me an answer.
Yeah, Clarence, I was going to say too, I keep telling our theologians, help me with these problems, because, the church still says the earth is 6,000 years old, but what do we do with that evidence then from geology that it's, 4.5 billion years old, and so on and so forth. And the questions continue, as you've already mentioned. So, and I think to keep the faith, I think that is so important, but to do that, we need our theologians to actually tackle and wrestle with these things rather than just pretend they're either not true or just ignore them. And so, yeah, I think unfortunately, biting the bullet here is seems to be a tough one. So I don't know, are there any theologians here ready to do this? To tackle that? It's all yours. So, yeah, thanks, Clarence.
Personally, I think we need to square up with our own selves and admit certain things. On the question of 6,000 years, the church keeps saying that, but it's obvious that the earth has been there for donkey's years, as we say, okay? And humanity has been there also for ages and ages. We're talking about Neanderthal and all of that, but yet I don't know, where are we going with that? Wouldn't it be more fruitful to admit and to reckon that these first 11 chapters of Genesis are simply mythical and deal with the thing from there? Wouldn't it be more fruitful?
Oh,
Well, lead the
I
way.
think Bryan agrees with you. I don't think there's any question about that. Clarence, I thank
Yeah.
you for your always provocative questions. And Kristen, before I come to, oh, I asked you to unmute, and so you might want to do that. But before I come to you, Lauren, I just want to say it's always so good to see someone who appears to have some beneficial effect on lowering the median age of this group. So I'm happy to see your face. But before we come to your question, Lauren wants to make announcements about next week.
It is lovely to see Christy. I've known her since she was very little, and just wanted to mention, in case you didn't know, some of you might not have known that our longtime friend, Christy's father, Dave Jarnes, did pass away, and they had last Sabbath had a memorial service for him. It was very moving and very nice. A lot of people spoke up and told wonderful stories of Dave. And Christy, our thoughts are with you. Also mentioned that Dave's sister, Carolyn Jeannie, is having her 60th birthday today. I think that's lovely. We don't normally announce everybody's birthday, but 60 on this very day. That's important. Congratulations, Carolyn. Next week, we are having one of the church's foremost scholars, a gentleman by the name of Sigve Tonstad, is going to be our teacher. Sigve Tonstad is known as a scholar of the book of Revelation. I asked him if he wanted to talk about Revelation. He said no, he thinks he'd rather do some exegetical and hermeneutical work on the letters of John. So we'll probably go that direction. But just so you know, whenever Dr. Tonstad speaks, it's a really something special. And so we'll look forward to Dr. Sigve Tonstad next week. And thank you, Bryan. This has been amazing. And now, Christy, carry on.
Yeah, and it may be a little confusing in the chat, but we said we have my dad's little sister, Jeannie, who's having the birthday today, my auntie. And then my mom is also on there as a different Jeannie Jarnes. So we have two Jeannie Jarneses in our family who come here regularly. But my Aunt Jeannie's on there as Carolyn Jean, so you can tell the difference. And she's the one with the birthday. And anyway, this was such an interesting presentation. My teenage son and my husband actually are both sitting in here too, listening. And my teenage son then really lowers our average here. And he left now because I'm talking. But anyway, so really appreciate it. It was so interesting. And it was interesting to hear from the scientific perspective on your perspective on that third and fourth generations, because that had always sounded so kind of cold to me. And years ago, I realized just seeing patterns in our family and other people's family, my students, that how trauma goes down through the generations, and that the actions of one generation that can add trauma to the next generation goes down through the generations, and had kind of taken that Bible verse in that context, but then also to add the scientific piece of that too, to the actual genetics of it, is really fascinating. And also, I don't know, I like anytime we can take something that God says that sounds like a punishment and realize that it's more of an observation or guidance or warning or that type of thing. So I appreciated that piece about it. And just this whole conversation, when you kind of combine those two pieces of like the nature piece, what you're talking about with the genetics and the science, and then that nurture piece, which your wife brought in too, I think. But you're a good team there. The two perspectives of that, the nature and nurture, and the experiences people have and the traumatic events or the abuse or whatever, and the way that can also affect. Just having thought about that over the past few years, I have come more and more, and I have not read up on this. I'm sure there's probably like a whole developed school of theological thought on this, but just in my own head makes me feel more and more like the idea of sin as a behavior is not really what we should be focusing on. Like if there's an issue that we have sin, that we need to be rescued from. I feel like it would be more of a state of being that we're all born into because, and I have read a little bit, just a quick article on that, the research where they're starting to say they don't know if people even have any free will. Is everything controlled by our genetics or by our experiences that happen to us, which I'm not sure that I would go that far, but just the more and more that we find out, that those are questions that I've had for years of how would God expect the same behaviors from people that come from such a wide variety of backgrounds and cultures and experiences and genetics and all of those things. And that really is becoming one of my strongest beliefs as I've been the past few years in this process of kind of reconstructing my faith, I guess. So, I mean, I do like what your wife added to that, that there are ways we can change and that we do have some choices we can make, but everybody's starting from such a different point. And I think that in that way, if you're going to look for that need for a savior and that need for grace, to think of it as the grace of the state that we are all in, this place, this experience. We can't control the sin environment that we are in that's not perfect, and we all have to be rescued, and our actions are not as much what we should be focusing on as just focusing on that there's grace.
Yeah, no, I'd love that because that was my urging. We just need more grace for one another because we have to recognize that, you know, who we are is, and I'm glad you mentioned nature and nurture because as a geneticist, I have to keep reminding my students, it's not just genetics. It's not just nature. There's also nurture. And that part does play a part too. You can't do anything about the nature part, but you can do stuff about the nurture part, you know. So, and the nurture part can affect the nature part to some degree. Some things can't be changed, and I think that's also part of it. So, if somebody's born intersex, I mean, they're intersex. That's what they are. But that doesn't mean there isn't something they can do to adapt to the condition that they have. But then the rest of us need to adapt to them and treat them with dignity and grace too. So anyway, yes, I appreciate that. It's great. And I love it. Yeah, the note here that we do have a number of younger people. I see them every so often. So you're not the only one, but that's great. And glad you have your teenage son there. So
and
thank you. Thanks so much.
Provocative thought. Chris, before I come to you, I know you'll indulge me. I need to make a brief commercial. I've become a bit of an evangelist about this, and it's very short. But I think some of you may know, this has to do with genetics, that my beautiful 18-year-old granddaughter had a terrible emotional mental health breakdown 2 years ago after she was her whole freshman year, you know, at home with the COVID virus. And a lot of young people have gone through things like that. And something, although I have time spent in that field, something I did not know, and this is what I am evangelistic about, is that when she was Baker acted and went into the hospital for a couple of days, they just immediately put her on an antidepressant, and she just wasted away for probably 6 months, and it was of no avail, only for us to discover down the road that if she had only had genetic testing, which is just a cheek swab and easy to do and is not that expensive, the purpose of that is to be able to identify the classification of drugs that she will respond to. And as soon as that was identified and a change was made, it was dramatic. But it's something that it's astounding, really, what they know and what they can do from a simple genetic test. And in addition to that, she learned that she has, her mother is my daughter, and that she has a gene that prevents her body from processing dopamine, serotonin, etc., the right way. So no wonder she was depressed. And the psychiatrist who treated her said, well, my daughter should probably be tested as well. And lo and behold, she has it also. But the beauty is that it can be treated with an over-the-counter drug that's cheap. And my daughter buys it on Amazon, and they'll both take it the rest of their lives. But this is a cautionary genetic story for those of you that have children or grandchildren that run into emotional problems. Be aware, genetic testing is important. So
yeah, unfortunately, that's not widely available. It's somewhat still in experimental stages, but I foresee a day when doctors will routinely, I hope, apply genetics to this, because there's lots of drugs. There's lots of choices between drugs. They do it for cancer treatment. They do it all the time for that.
Right.
So they
Right.
should be doing it for other drugs. Yeah.
Oh, when I just think of the time she spent where she's trying her best and nothing is
Mhm.
getting better. And so
Mhm.
just something important to know. So Chris, thank you for your patience. I think we're good with time for you and the other two we have. So join again.
Well, my comment is that the Adventist Church operates one of the best medical networks in the world, which is all based on science. And we have great ways of treating people. And that goes off of what you mentioned, Linda. We delve into the science of the mind, and yet the mind is still, the great mystery of the human body. It's this jelly up there that does us. My comment is just to put in a Snoopy cartoon, which we used recently, and Charlie Brown is asking Snoopy. Snoopy's on his roof and he is typing on his typewriter, and Charlie says, "What you're doing?" And Snoopy says, "I'm writing a book." And Charlie says, "I hope you have a good title." And Snoopy says, "I have the perfect title." And then he types it out. "Has it ever occurred to you that you might be wrong?" And religions are not in the habit of admitting that they are wrong. And I come back to that the church corporate wants to write theology based solely on the Bible and their understanding of the Bible, or traditional understandings, without looking at any modern input or input from science and the great studies that have occurred since then. And that's just unconscionable to me. And I'm just sitting with that angst right now.
Yeah, you and me too.
Thank you, Bryan. And I look forward to visiting with you soon.
Affirmation all around. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for coming back on for that. Emmanuel, we're glad to see you this afternoon. What are you thinking?
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to piggyback on what Clarence and the last speaker say. We call ourselves student of the book, but the 6,000 years is just a fallacy. It's a brother for Ireland, James Usher. He came with this idea with no evidence that the planet was created in 4004 BC. And we run with it. And it seems this is now Genesis chapter 51. So we have no biblical evidence for that, but we run with it. And Dr. Lawrence Gerati wrote an article a couple of years back saying that we cannot use genealogy to calculate the age of the universe.
Snowing in Cobb.
He got into trouble for that.
Only
But
41
it seems that
degrees.
more things change, nothing changed at all. So we have just to forget about Archbishop Usher, even though Ellen White said, yes, 6,000, the evidence are not there.
Mhm. Yeah, Emmanuel, just to add to that, it's interesting that if you use the genealogies that we have discovered, that some of which were not in some of the older some of the manuscripts used for King James, and if we realize that they probably left names out of the genealogies, you don't get 6,000 anyway if you redo it. You get other numbers. So it's and of course with geological evidence, that's a whole other line of evidence that it's too bad we feel like we have to ignore it, as a church. But yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Usher's chronology, yeah. Mm.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Clarence. Always much appreciated. Eduardo, you have been unmuted. Welcome.
Thank you. This is my first time participating. Bryan, I want to throw at you to practice mathematics. Let me read for you something. According to FEMA, the Hurricane Katrina carried 40 million cubic yards to the ocean of debris, which if you put it in a building 100 by 100 feet, it will reach 13 miles to the skies. And I have witnessed two cleaning of two reservoirs carrying hundreds of millions of debris. Do you think that the Earth can survive millions of years with this kind of erosion?
Well, yeah, and I'm not a geologist, so I can't really probably give a really good answer to that. But if you look at what geology I do know, if you look at the history of sedimentation versus erosion, the two balance each other out over time. So I would have to bring in a geologist to give a better answer than that. But that really explains at least millions, if not billions of years of time pretty easily. But again, I'm not a geologist, so I usually just trust my geology colleagues to tell me that, yeah, it's certainly possible. And I know people do try and argue things about erosion rates and stuff like that to support things like worldwide flood and evidence of certain sort. But again, I go to my geology friends and kind of trust them on that. So yeah, I think that it's perfectly, to my mind, possible to see such things go back and forth. And that's a localized, by the way, catastrophic event. And we have good evidence for some of those. I don't know, but probably people here have remembered the Eastern Washington Scantlands, the what's called Brett's Flood, another good example of large amounts of material being displaced in a very short period of time. So anyway, yeah, that's the best I can do for that. Yeah.
If you can ask your friends, because the idea that I have is that sedimentation comes as a rock.
Yeah.
And the debris, the debris that is coming down to the ocean is soft.
Yeah.
How we can replace it. Thank you for your time.
Yeah. You're well. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Eduardo, for joining us. We hope you'll come back again. You can see this is an active group. And Lauren, I'm going to come to you, but just really quickly, it was a question asked by Ed Reifsnyder, and of course he ran. He didn't actually come on and raise his hand about it. But he asked the question, are people genetically inclined to be righteous? What would you say to that, Bryan? Or conversely?
Well, as I said about behavioral characteristics, that in general, most of them are about 50% heritability. So I would suspect, and there have been people, by the way, that have looked for, quotes, the God gene and things like that. And I don't think there's any one gene anyway. But there certainly appear to be personality types, behavioral characteristics that would certainly be compatible with what we might say somebody who's spiritual. They behave in a spiritual way. So I think there's probably a certain amount of heritability there as well. And religiosity would be a characteristic that would probably have a genetic component. And
on the environmental side, it is probably easier for some people to trust than others because of their life.
Yeah, and that's another one, has to do with your hormonal responses to stress. I mean, some people trust better than others because of those differences, and those are often hardwired in too. Although my wife would tell you, we can teach you to modify those things. You can accommodate, you can, what should I say, habituate and change in some of those ways, but some of it's going to be hardwired. So, yeah.
Well, I echo the sentiments of many who have put in on the chat how fascinating your presentation has been. Thank you. For my own part.
Yeah, and I've missed the chat because I'm too busy, interacting here, so I miss all those comments. But anyway,
lots have weighed in on it, so I thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Lauren, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I just want to remind you again that we have the great Bible scholar Sigve Tonstad coming next week. And I think it should be another great class. This was a very good class. Bryan, if we really wanted to at the very last open up a can of worms, some years ago, I picked up a magazine in an antique store that was from the Kellogg Foundation, which was labeled, and the Kellogg's association with Seventh-day Adventists was labeled a magazine about eugenics. I don't know if a lot of people realize that John Harvey Kellogg's foundation turned into a eugenicist organization before it finally died away. So there's another interesting genetic little bit that you can explore for our next class, Bryan.
Okay. Yeah, because that's the dark side. That's the dark side of this kind of information. Because people want to say, okay, we know this stuff now. How can we use it? And the U.S. We often blame Nazi Germany for some of their stuff, but you know what? They learned it from us.
Yep.
Some of that stuff about breeding the right kind of race and da da da.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's very interesting. We have a little bit of that, not just in biblical history, but in our own Seventh-day Adventist history there through the Kellogg Foundation. Hey, thank you all very much. This was wonderful.